to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one true God, now and forevermore. Amen. A very pleasant evening to all of you. Greetings and welcome to this here, the fourth and last session of this series on biblical geography. As we have been talking about over the past three sessions, the series particularly details about geographical factors within biblical narratives and how they influenced the stories, the events, as well as the spiritual growth of Christianity. So for most of you, this may seem like a repetition, but this is just to draw an introduction for any of you who may not have been present or available for the past few sessions. So obviously, we began our very first session with Abraham, our patriarchal father, and his journey all the way from Ur of the Chaldeans, or from Mesopotamia, through Haran, and all the way down to Shechem, as you can see circled in this map. And that is where he builds his first altar, as we read in the book of Genesis in chapter 12. And of course, as we saw last week, that is also where Joshua and all come back at a very later stage. So Abraham further moves down to Bethel, right across Ai, where he builds his second altar that we read in the very next verse in that particular chapter itself. And he continues on his journey down into Hebron and resides by the oak of Mamre. And the reason for this particular path, as we saw in the previous weeks, was the well-established trade route, also called the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea. And so from there, we know that he went into Egypt. He comes back through the Negev into the Hebron region. And then later on, the stories of Isaac and finally Jacob and his sons, particularly Joseph going into Egypt, and then the brothers following him, and then the Israelites staying in Egypt for well over 430 years. And at the end of that, they come out of Egypt and they have their long exodus. Sorry. Right. And as is shown in the map, after their period in the wilderness of Sinai, they come up and they are blocked by Edom. And so they come into the Moabite region where they spend a good number of years before a good amount of time before passing through Mount Nebo, where God shows Moses the promised land. And then they cross the river Jordan, set up their first camp in Gilgal, where they also set up the monument of 12 stones taken from the Jordan River, again, where all the male children that came through the Exodus were circumcised, and also the place where they celebrated their first Passover. And then we talked about how they formed a treaty with the people of Gibeon, which forced the other kingdoms of the area, such as Jebus or Jerusalem, as is shown over here, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, all to rebellion against them. And so they battle against them, and that leads to them achieving or conquering that entire region. Later, Joshua goes up all the way to Mount Ebal, right above Shechem, and that is where they built an altar and they have their covenant, the renewal of the covenant once again. So, this is what we had covered in all the past weeks. So, the reason why I recapped this was to show that from the time of the Exodus, the Ark of Covenant was continuously on the move. And that is why the geographical position keeps changing. And because of that, the center of worship as well kept on changing. And so we concluded last week with the time of the judges. And as you could see from the screen shared, with the very first judge, the Judge Othniel, having his who was from Gilgal. And so the differences between the Judah region and the Manasseh region, or the highlands of Benjamin. So that was Othniel and Ehud. And their positioning shows how they had particular battles with people of those particular regions. Othniel obviously had to have his battles against the Mesopotamian kings who came all the way down. But then the people of Egypt, the people of Israel were worshipping Baal and Asherah, who were Canaanite gods because of the region that they were based in. And then for the time of Ehud, because of the positioning of Gilgal, they had their battles against the Moabite king Eglon, along with the Ammonites, because that was the closer region to them. And then we talked about Deborah, and then we talked about Gideon, and Gideon, as you can see, is right up by Issachar, where it is much more closer to the Midianites. That's why he has his battles with the Midianites. Jephthah, on the other hand, is a bit more below, and so it is in direct conflict with the Ammonites. And finally, we concluded with Samson, who was from the Dan tribe, close to Benjamin, which borders along Philistia. And that is why his battles were against the Philistines. So when we talk about the Philistines, and the reason we talk more about the Philistines is because that's how our focus is now changing. The Philistines, particularly of the five kingdoms of Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Now, the reason why that is particularly important is because if you are all familiar with the story of Samson, for instance, with Samson and Delilah, particularly it's these five kings that come to Delilah and offer her money so that she could get out of Samson the information about his strength. So the particularity of that is that these rulers offer Delilah 1,100 shekels of silver each. And when you calculate shekels in today's modern day calculations, that probably works out to around 13 kilograms. So between the five of them, you're talking about 65 kilograms of silver that is being given as a bribe to someone. And you would assume, how do they get that much of wealth? The reason being, once again, because these were the prime cities and the prime kingdoms along the path of the way of the sea, or the Via Maris, before entering into the Egyptian region. So they were obviously very busy and bustling trade centers. And so their rulers would have had sufficient money to give out in terms of protecting their own territories. So from there, we also talked about the distribution of the tribes. And as you can see in this map, as is all in different colors, the tribes spread out to the east as well as the west of the River Jordan, far up north to Asher and Naphtali, and all the way down to the wilderness of Zin, which is the southern part of the Negev. And a bird's eye view of this map will show you that Shiloh, circled right in the center, does naturally form the central location of these. So during the time of the judges, and that's a considerable period of time, during the time of the judges, as the center of worship shifts through different places, the Ark of Covenant ends up, which is at the tabernacle in Shiloh. As we read in Judges chapter 18, verse 31, where it talks about Micah and his idols, not the prophet Micah, but the Micah in Judges, that they continued to use the idol that Micah had made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. So, Shiloh, being geographically central to this entire region, naturally becomes the place of the tabernacle or the house of God. And that is thrown more light as we move through the book of the Judges. For example, in Judges chapter 21, verse 19, we read, "But look, there is the annual festival of the Lord in Shiloh." In the New Testament, we read about the people going to the temple of Jerusalem. But during the time of the Judges, Jerusalem as a city didn't exist. The Ark of Covenant was in Shiloh primarily because of its centralized location. So the people would go for an annual festival of the Lord in Shiloh, which lies north of the Bethel. And this is where it gets most interesting. East of the road that goes from Bethel to Shechem. So that road that went from Bethel to Shechem would have been like a very popular national highway, if you will. And this is exactly the way of the sea, the Via Maris that we talked about numerous times earlier. So you see how the location of Shiloh, because of where it is, becomes a factor that gives rise to the place of worship over there, the tabernacle or the Ark of Covenant being kept there. And of course, we are also given further details that there are vineyards in that area as well. So this continued all the way till the end of the time of the judges. So this is where the biblical narratives shifts its focus in the entire salvific story, in the entire salvation story, where we had Gilgal going all the way down to Bethel, and then going all the way down to Shechem, and all those from the initial altars, and it finally ends up in Shiloh. And the reason why that particular standpoint of time in history is important is because now the Bible, at the end of Judges, starts focusing particularly on Jesus. So, because it is focusing on Jesus, it traces the ancestral path of Jesus, linking it all the way to David. And when we talk about David, undeniably, we have to talk about Saul. And because we have to talk about Saul, we have to talk about who anoints Saul, and that is none other than Samuel. So that's where the first Samuel begins. And the first chapter of the book of First Samuel begins with Hannah, who is Samuel's mother, going up from Ramah, which is their hometown, to Shiloh to pray at the tabernacle where the Ark of Covenant is. And that is where the priest Eli resides. So Hannah goes up to Shiloh, offers the sacrifice, and says that if she gets a baby, she will dedicate it to God. And hence, when the baby is born, Hannah goes up to Shiloh and entrusts Samuel to Eli. So the focus shifts from the south of Canaan, or the Judah region, where you have the battles against the Philistines and the Amalekites, etc. So now, as we talk about Shelah, in the second chapter of the book of First Samuel, we read that the Israelites go into battle with Philistine. And the Philistine region, as we had just seen earlier, is right where you can see on the western or the left side of the map, with the cities of Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Gath, Lachish, etc. And it's in this particular area that the wars are going on with the Philistines and, of course, the Amalekites who are further south. So, because of these wars, the Israelites bring the Ark of Covenant from Shiloh to Ebenezer. And this is where the Philistines capture the Ark of Covenant and then take it to the temple of Dagon in Ashdod. And that we read in the book of First Samuel, in the very first chapters. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. And then if you can see the fourth verse highlighted, so the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the Ark of Covenant of the Lord Almighty. So the focus is that the Ark of Covenant moves from Shiloh down south. They move it to Ebenezer, but then the Philistines capture it and take it to Ashdod. And then as we read through the chapters, we realize that the Philistines too understand that they have problems because they have captured the Ark of Covenant. So they take it to Gath. The people of Gath say, no, we don't want it because we're going to have problems as well. So they take it to Ekron, they take it to Beth Shemesh, and eventually it finds its way to Kiriath Jearim. And then as we move through the books, we realize from Kiriath Jearim how it comes to Jerusalem. So you see this particular geographical location of the Philistines and their cities is how the central worship point shifts from Shiloh further south to Jebus, as was the name of the city at that time, or later, after the time of David, it becomes Jerusalem. So now the focus of Israelite religiosity has shifted to Jerusalem. And that is where you have all the rest of our biblical content focused on Jerusalem, the Temple of Jerusalem. And so we move forward. And interestingly, the Ark of Covenant as such is only mentioned up till the end of the Second Chronicles, at the time of Josiah, King Josiah, and that is around BC 630. After that, we do not read about the Ark of Covenant in the Bible because the focus has shifted from the Ark of Covenant to the actual temple of God, the temple of Jerusalem. So looking back at this map, Saul was from Zuph, which is on the border of the Benjamin in the hill country of Ephraim. And he is anointed as king at Mizpah, the little highlighted one over there. And they have their battle against the Ammonites. And why is it that they have their battle against their Ammonites? Because at this point of time, they are right across from the Ammonite region. And it is in this particular battle that Saul loses favor with God because his men keeps the exploits of the battle. And as a result of this direct war with the Ammonites, Saul loses favor with God, and hence we have the choosing of David from Bethlehem. And again, you would have wondered why the most famous story with David at the very initial stages of his life is the battle against the Philistines, where he kills the giant Goliath. And that is because the focus has shifted from Shiloh down, where the Ark of Covenant was at Kiriath Jearim, and hence the Philistines are attacking that way. So it is particularly this battle that David goes to, which is in the valley of Elah. And that is where David kills the giant Goliath. Now, after the fallout with Saul, and you will realize that I'm going to quickly jump across in the timeline because our focus is primarily on the geography. So after the fallout with Saul, and this is after David has killed Goliath, and Saul continues as king, and Samuel has anointed David. Saul tries to kill David. And so David actually escapes towards the Philistine region. But he goes further south down, which is the wilderness of Zin or the wilderness of Paran further south. And that is where you have the Amalekites. And so all the stories of David building up his military forces are based on the battles with the Amalekites. Eventually, Saul is killed in a battle with the Philistines at Mount Gilboa. And that's right up there. In the meanwhile, David is building his forces right down here by the Amalekites. And so with that, we move further on until into the book of the 2nd Samuel, which talks about the extent of the kingdoms of David. And how he expands his kingdom. And there are numerous geographical factors over here. We know that David moves back into Hebron, and he becomes the king of Judah because that is the region where it is. And then after his battles with Saul or Saul's sons, he eventually becomes the king of the northern part as well, thus extending his kingdom to the entire Israel as we would know it. So he conquers Jebus first, which he renames of David, or the fortress of Zion, as it was also called, or as we today know it as Jerusalem. 2 Samuel chapter 5. So then we go on to understand that he defeats the Philistines, and the Ark of Covenant is brought into Jerusalem. He conquers the Ammonites with cooperation from the foreigners as well. And the reason why the cooperation of the foreigners are important is because, for example, stories like that include Uriah the Hittite. The Hittite are an entirely different foreign nation, but they were cohabiting along these Canaanite, Israelite regions as well. So it is the battle that David had against the Ammonites that sends his army under the leadership of Joab to battle, but he decides to stay back in Jerusalem. And that is where he sees Bathsheba on a one fine, moony evening. And then we know all the incidents that take place after that, leading up into the epic Psalm 51 that will go down in history as one of the greatest songs of repentance. So the stories of conquest continue all over. And particularly in 2 Samuel chapter 21, we read about a famine for 3 consecutive years. Now, obviously, we have to compare this famine with the time of the sons of Jacob, where Joseph goes into Egypt, and then his brothers follow him again because there is a famine in that region. Similarly, at the time of King David as well, there is a famine in this particular place. And that brings us to the end of the book of 2 Samuel, where David orders a census. Now, God punishes him for that particular act, but he gives him 3 choices of punishments. David chooses the 3-day plague. Now we read that the Lord withdrew his hand at the threshing floor of Aruna the Jebusite. This is in 2 Samuel. And as simple as this may seem, it is of great spiritual content as well. That as when you look at the map, the hand of God was moving all the way from the northern part, coming down, and when it reached the threshing floor of Aruna the Jebusite from the Jebus from Jerusalem, that the hand of the Lord stopped. And this is where David builds an altar to the Lord at the threshing floor of Aruna the Jebusite. And I'm sure this name will sound familiar to at least a few of you when you have heard the Hutomo being sung of a particular stanza. Yebusayande Kalatarayil Kartave Tiruhidamarna Shidipalagani Davidin Paripavanamam Beli Pole. That sacrifice was offered at this altar on the threshing floor of Aruna the Jebusite. A prayer that we use even today that has stemmed out of events unfolded as a result of the physical conquest of these geographical landscapes. So let's move forward and we jump all the way into the first book of Kings, which commences with the epics of Solomon. And his kingdom expanded further up north, as you can see in the darker greener shade, up until the tips of the Euphrates River, and south all the way to the borders of Egypt. That was the extent of the kingdom. Now, when Solomon builds his temple, there are particular imports that he brings. For instance, when he was building the temple, Hiram, the king of Tyre, that is circled in the map. Tyre being a Phoenician trade port. Now you would wonder why something from Tyre had to be shipped down to Jerusalem when there was a closer route by land. But it is because of the highlands and because of the mountains that would have prevented the easy transportation of timber. And hence you have the sea route from Tyre to Joppa, through which the cedars of Lebanon were transported. The cedars of Lebanon specifically mentioned because Tyre, Tyre and Sidon were not part of Solomon's kingdom, but they were part of the Phoenician kingdom. And now the cedars of Lebanon, obviously, as you all know, are majestic, large, durable, and fragrant wood, and it symbolizes strength, majesty, and God's provisions, as is recorded in Psalm 92, verse 12, which we have borrowed for our Kokilion, or the intercessory prayers to the saints. The righteous shall flourish like palm trees, like the cedars of Lebanon. So at the time that Solomon is building his temple, he imports these cedars, Lebanon le Khairil, from Tyre through the ship port, through the ship route down into Joppa, and that is where they transport it to Jerusalem. Had there not been established trade routes, we have to doubt whether the Temple of Jerusalem would ever have gotten those cedars of Lebanon. And again, as you can see in the map, the kingdom of Solomon expands quite southward, all the way down to Elath. And we saw Elath at the time of the Exodus. And the reason why that is important is because Solomon's popularity spread from there all across Arabia. And that would have been past Syria, past Ammon, past Moab, and past Edom, all the way down into Arabia. And it is the awareness of this wisdom of Solomon that spread across the regions that attracted people like the Queen of Sheba, Sheba being a place on the northern part of modern day Yemen, if you will. So, all the way from there, Solomon's wisdom is known and people come. So, it shows the geographical extent of the greatness of this particular kingdom. And that is the reason why, for the building of the temple, that they were even able to get gold from Ophir. Ophir again being all the way down south. And we use that particularly in our baptism liturgy. Ophir Tangat Kilingyal, the one who wears the gold from Ophir. Obviously, in our baptisms, we don't really get gold from Ophir, but it is symbolizing that particular gold. And this gold from Ophir was brought specifically for the building of the temple in Jerusalem at the time of Solomon. Now, after the time of Solomon, and let me clear out my annotations. So, after the time of Solomon, we see a division into northern and southern kingdoms. So, although the kingdom of Israel was united under David and Solomon, there were definitely tensions between the north and the south. That was never resolved. The jealousy and the animosity behind a civil war. So it didn't begin with Solomon's descendant, but rather it had its roots all the way from the time of the judges as well. Historically, there was always tension, particularly from the hill country of Ephraim, which was the most prominent tribe in the northern part of the kingdom and between Judah. Ephraim claimed all its promises, as we see in Genesis chapter 48 and 49. Joshua, who conquered the promised land, was an Ephraimite. Samuel, Israel's greatest prophet, was from Ephraim. So it was the Ephraimites who eventually revolted against David, who was from the tribe of Judah and who became king over all of Israel, because Ephraim no longer had a claim to leadership, although Shiloh was first in their area. So the focus shifted from that, and that's how the differences began that eventually led to the breaking of the kingdom into the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. And this particularly takes place at the time of Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Particularly, Jeroboam, who revolts against Solomon's son Rehoboam, tries to take back the prominence from Jerusalem back into Shechem. And particularly, we are told that he makes two golden calves. And he places one at Dan and the other at Bethel. So you can see how Dan and Bethel form the northern and the southern boundaries of the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, the northern kingdom, the kings of the northern kingdom eventually started ruling from Samaria because they had their holy place in Shechem. Shechem, named after Shemer, from whom King Omri purchased the land. And the son of King Omri is Ahab. And that's where we get on into our further biblical narratives. It's during the time of Ahab, the son of Omri, that Elijah from Tishbe, which is in the Gilead area, across or east of the Jordan, he prophesies about a drought in that land. Again, you will recall the famines and droughts that are recurrent in this area whenever there is a lack of rain. And so in Elijah's journey, he is fed by the ravens. We know that. Then we know the story of the widow at Zarephath of Sidon, which is further up north of Tyre in the Phoenician kingdom, where the jug of oil and the jar of flour never ran out, and whose son Elijah also healed. So from Samaria, we see Elijah going up to Jezreel and the valley of Jezreel up until Mount Carmel, where he challenges the prophets of Baal. And you all know the story of the incident between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. But at the very end of that, in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 43, Elijah tells his servant, go and look at the sea. Clouds of rain are coming. So one has to wonder, how would he be so easy to go and look at the sea? And that is precisely because Mount Carmel is right at the tip of the Mediterranean Sea. And so the rain-bringing clouds come upon immediately. And after Elijah has killed all of Baal's priests, Queen Jezebel, enraged by the death of the prophets, vows to kill Elijah, thus prompting him to flee away. So he escapes from Jezebel And his escape from Jezebel, Queen Jezebel, from the valley of Jezreel through Beersheba all the way down to Horeb, or the other name of it, Mount Sinai. Again, similar to that of the Exodus, it is symbolic of the preparation, of the fasting, etc. And you all know how the fasting of Elijah for 40 days is repeatedly used in our Lenten meditations. And that 40-day fasting takes place because of his journey from Beersheba all the way down to Mount Sinai, or Horeb, as is called in the book of Kings. And it was at Horeb that Elijah has the theophany, experiencing God's presence in a very still, small voice, as opposed to the thunders and the loud sounds. So the prophetic ministry of Elijah and his disciple Elisha, it continues in the northern kingdom of Israel, and these has many significant geographical notes. You might be able to put your sight on at least a handful that have been put up on the screen. But in the interest of time, we need to move on. And so our next major geographical shift would be the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivity, where Israelites are taken into exile. Now, the Assyrian captivity, or the Assyrian exile, is the period in Jewish history, and this is at the very end of the time of the kings, where a number of Israelites of the northern kingdom that we just saw earlier were taken into Assyria as captives, and that is the modern day Syria or Iraq. The northern kingdom was the first of the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah to fall, and it was conquered by Assyrian monarchs in at least three different time periods between 734 and 722 BC. So the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel, Samaria, was eventually captured in 724. And the reason why this plays significance is because all those who were taken as captive into exile in Assyria never returned. They were never able to return. You would notice that the later exile into Babylon, which took place much later in the 7th century BC, 630 odd. The people from the southern kingdom of Judah were taken into exile, but later on, once the Babylonian Empire was overtaken by the Persian Empire during the time of King Cyrus, they were able to return. So this geographical displacement of the northern kingdom into Assyria creates a vacuum, and then they are nowadays called the 10 lost tribes. And it is only the southern kingdom who were taken into exile by Babylonia that managed to return during the time of the Persian kingdom. And so they returned back to Judah and reclaimed the land. But the northern kingdom, since the people did not return, the Assyrians filled them up with Gentile populations or foreigners, as was. And that is the root of the disputes between the Jews and the Samaritans that we see extending all the way into the New Testament. So these are a few of the geographical displacements and the roots of how they affect the biblical narratives. So having said all of those, I would like to conclude at this particular time. Geographical factors in biblical narratives have huge significance. It is not merely the spiritual matter that is being communicated, but the physical impact of it has huge significance on biblical stories. And I'd just like to recap maybe four or five of them before I conclude. The mountains and the hills, as you could see, all along these stories that we have been talking about, they offer um, or they represent power, they represent spiritual significance, and by extension of that, they represent it as a place of refuge. God's mountain symbolizes his supreme authority and the gathering of nations for worship, as they gathered at Mount Ebal, as they gathered at the mounts in Jebus or in Jerusalem. As we read in Psalm 121, verse 1, I lift up my eyes to the mountains. So, as they lift up their eyes to the mountains symbolizing God's greatness, that is where the question comes, where does my help come from? It doesn't come from the top of the mountain, but what it symbolizes. But it is that geographical narrative that draws our attention into it. Even in the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 2, we read, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established on the highest of the mountains. And we talked about all those mountains in the earlier sessions as well. The deserts, the wildernesses, clearly indicating spiritual dryness and periods of testing, periods of purification, not just for the Exodus journey, but later on, as we just talked about, for David as well. And that same theme carries all the way into the New Testament with Jesus's temptation in the wilderness. A place of preparation, a place of purification, a place of judgment, if you will. The Jordan River, undoubtedly symbolic of crossing over from the old to the new. And then again, Mount Zion or Jerusalem, the Negev, similar to the wilderness. And then again, as we go through the prophetic books, there are particular references to many cities as well. For example, the Babylonian captivity that we just talked about, where people are taken all the way into Babylon. And they try to recall the good days that they had in their own kingdom. And so, sitting by the rivers of Babylon is where they sing the psalm, by the rivers of Babylon, which most of you know is a very popular hip song as well. Psalm 137. And then again, very familiar psalms that we have. Psalm 23, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. So these geographical factors of mountains, valleys, rivers, etc., tagged along with physical places, Babylon, Nineveh, where the prophet Nahum prophesied, places like Tyre and Sidon, places like Egypt, referencing of it, places like Edom, where the entire book of the prophet Obadiah is based at, places like Samaria that create tension, where prophets like Hosea and Micah as well prophesied. So I hope that these indications, the very bare minimal amount of information I have been able to share about these geographical locations, have been able to create at least a spark of interest in you to enable you for further personal study that will certainly enhance the growth and the understanding of your own spirituality. Once again, I would like to thank the organizers of the eMGOCSM for this blissful opportunity that I have received. And thank you all. God bless.
We can proceed for the Q&A session. You may ask your questions either in chat. Acha, with your permission, can we proceed to the Q&A? Yes. So you can unmute or ask directly, or you can put it in your chat. Questions relevant to the theme.
Hello, Achan, Rachel here. This Phoenicia, what you mentioned is what currently, what is it? Lebanon?
Yes, yes. Lebanon and the western tips of Syria, as we know now.
And Philistine is Palestine.
Philistine is Palestine, and you would have noticed that um, one of the Philistine kingdoms was Gaza.
Yeah.
I think that needs no further light to be thrown on it right now. But that particular strip, the Philistine strip, has even evolved to what we know today as the Gaza Strip. Of course, that is a completely different topic. The political understanding of these places, it's a entirely different topic and would take a lot more of time. But the evolvement of the political kingdom of Israel today and the Palestinian regions and the conflicts between them. Again, this is all an outcome, well, as the Jews claim, this is all an outcome of the Assyrian and Babylonian captivity, from which certain people were able to return back to Judah, but the vast majority were not able to. And then there are further displacements after the time of Greece as well, where the Romans come and capture, and then again they are displaced. So they all build up in the grand scheme of the political understanding of it.
Actually, I would have never known so many things, because this is such an interesting topic. But there is so much of information. I would find it difficult to retain it, but it was very, very interesting. And I really find it worth the while, listening to you. I'm sure it will help me in the future
Thank
also.
you. Thank you very much. I can only hope that, like I said, there is a spark of interest that has been lit up that will enable all of you to think in such lines as well. I mean, it's not to challenge any of our theological or spiritual positions, absolutely in no way at all. But like I said, such a perspective of understanding as well uh, throws greater depth into what we believe in.
Thank you, Achan.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ajay, it also adds to the point, this is the first time I'm attending something so, exhaustive. But it also gives to the fact that, it brings credibility to the Bible also. Very often we tend to take like a myth, but then the whole thing is being so beautifully told, and it's so interconnected. So it kind of, people when they go to Israel, we say, once you go to Israel, the Bible speaks, what you were reading. So this is almost you took through us through this whole Old Testament readings. So it's so beautiful. Thank you, Acha, for this lovely session. Over to any other questions anybody would like to ask?
Yes, hi, it's Lavita here. I have a question. I mean, you alluded to it, and I know it's difficult to, in terms of current events, my question would be, and I know it's all very political at the moment, but just in terms of, from the biblical aspect of it, I mean, you have a lot of conversation going around that because God made the covenant with Abraham in the land, as you covered over the past few weeks, and I mean, is that still relevant in current context? take away the politicizing of the current events. I mean, is there still a tribes of Israel? Is this land still a type of covenant land for the tribes of Israel? Or does it still have its biblical relevance today as it did over the past 4 weeks that you covered? I don't know if my question makes sense,
So,
but I know it's a lot to unpack.
Well, in a nutshell, you can't really say that we follow exactly the physical promises as such, what we read in the Old Testament, because Christ has fulfilled all of them and he has given new meaning to it. So, as far as we Christians are concerned, the Israel is not just the physical Israel anymore, but it is of a greater meaning. Jerusalem is the new Jerusalem. It is a greater meaning behind it. So it would not be a literal going back into the physical lands of it, but it would be a spiritual growth as such. But undoubtedly, when we use the terminologies and the names that are in the Bible, as Christians as well, we too tend to have an affinity towards it. So when we say Israel, for us, it is the new Israel. I mean, we would never, we as, I'm assuming all of us present in this meeting over here are of Indian origin, ethnically. So we could never ethnically be a Jew. But that doesn't mean that the spiritual understanding of Israel is unachievable to us. Physically, we couldn't, that is given. But we have a new understanding for it. But even so, when we hear the name Israel, we tend to have an affinity towards it. That could be the reason for at least some sort of bias in many perspectives nowadays. I'm assuming, but maybe you could also throw your thoughts on that as well. I'm trying to be as diplomatic as possible.
Yeah, they have to be too diplomatic.
I know, and I'm trying to be the same, and I'm struggling. Yes.
No,
I understand
okay.
the spiritual aspect of the new Israel. I mean, of how Jesus came to fulfill the law and everything. I think it's just the current noise around, obviously, the current situation and the current tensions over the land, and it keeps being in different circles, of course, depending which circle you're sitting in. It keeps going back to the biblical aspect which you've just covered over the last few weeks. I mean, it keeps relating modern issues over the land to the Bible, so to speak. And I think that, I mean, there's a lot of confusion about it, and it's difficult conversations when you're having with different people. But
undoubtedly, the political understanding that we have today is completely different. It is completely different from what was in the Bible, because obviously the world situations were different, nations were different, cultural, social positions were different, etc. So you can't just pick only the political situation of it and claim that. For instance, I mean, the biggest battle of the wise ones nowadays are that Israel, the area, belongs to the Jews as such, whereas there is a claim for the Palestinian area, which is highlighted as the Muslim area as such. That was not the case of the biblical times. I mean, this one half didn't exist at that time. So it wouldn't be a fair comparison as such. Political situations have changed completely. So it's regardless of whether it's a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew. I think it's about the ethnic heritage, maybe.
Okay.
But for us, undoubtedly, when we say Israel, we always relate that to our spiritual understanding of Israel.
Spiritual understanding, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions.
Yes, so good evening, Achan, seniors, and my dear friends. As this would be the last session from Father Stanley David James, I'd like to give my thoughts about the session and also the vote of thanks. So, Acha, biblical geography is a topic which made us very curious, especially for the ones who were good in geography at school. Honestly saying, we found it difficult to follow it up in the beginning, as we felt we should have known the basics of geography of Middle East to match your expertise. Most of us would try to skip the names of the place in Bible, except if it was for a quiz. But now we are convinced that each place in the Bible narrative is not a coincidence, but has theological interpretations. We are now curious to visit the places, or at least to go through the map of the Middle East, revise on the lessons you have taught us. So we want to thank you for opening up a new way of understanding the Old Testament and Israel through its geopositioning and landscapes. On behalf of eMGOCSM and our General Secretary Vivek Achan, we are thankful for you to take this courage to explain a complex topic like the physical background of biblical narratives and its theological interpretations. Once again, we thank you and our sincere prayers for your future projects. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Laluchasan, for your vote of thanks. To conclude this blessed gathering, I now invite Reverend Father Stanley David to lead us in the closing prayer.
Glory to you, praise to you, thousands of praises to you. Glory, Lord, glory to you. Have mercy upon us all. May the love of God the Father, the grace of the only begotten Son, and the communion and indwelling of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.